It's a serious situation in Afghanistan. The fact that the Taliban's now effectively in control. Joining me live now is Rodger Shanahan from the Lowy Institute. Rodger, good to see you. Thanks for your time this morning. So I don't think it comes as much of a surprise that this is the ending, but perhaps the speed with which the Taliban has been able to work is the biggest surprise of all. What's your take on the events of the last 24 hours?
Well, certainly events travelled at a withering pace. As you said, most people understood that this would be the eventual endgame, but nobody quite understood the speed with which the Taliban would be able to achieve this. And at the end of the day, they'd been working diligently on their information operations campaign in the cities and in the countryside. And at the end of the day, the Afghan security forces either wouldn't or couldn't defend their territory.
You got to hand it to the Taliban in the end, don't you, Rodger? They are an effective fighting force.
Yeah, listen, I don't think anybody has thought they're not an effective fighting force. They've got a singular aim. They're relatively united, and they really have no other options other than to pursue their ideological aim. And it's taken them 20 years, but they've achieved it.
Was it the right call to leave?
Yes, listen, if after 20 years you can't build an effective national defence force that's capable or willing to defend territory where they outnumber and they outgun the opposition, then it's not going to be achieved in 25 or 30 or 35 years. And it's going to be, it's a hard decision for anybody to make, but you've got to make it at some point. And President Biden has decided that if the Afghan security forces aren't going to defend the territory, then he's not going to ask the sons and daughters of the United States or other coalition partners to do what the Afghan security forces won't do.
In your view, Rodger, what did it actually achieve in the end, the war in Afghanistan?
Well, it achieved its initial aim of denying a safe territory for terrorist groups to plan and execute operations against the West. That short-term aim was achieved, then it morphed into a much broader nation-building activity, and it depends how you want to measure it. Ultimately, obviously, the military operation was military campaign was a failure, but there are a whole range of social factors of which there are significant improvements in education, in life expectancy. Infant mortality rates have dropped significantly. A middle class had emerged. Now, the question is going to be, in the future, how many of these social indicators remain as improvements in the overall life of Afghans? But in terms of the military campaign plan, the military campaign ended in failure. It doesn't mean that there is no positive legacy left in Afghanistan.
What are the global ramifications of this, Rodger? What happens from now?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, isn't it? We've seen the Taliban releasing prisoners from the Afghan prisons, so people are going to have to get a handle on who was released, where they are, what freedom of action they have in the country. On the one hand, it's in the Taliban's best interest not to go back to their old ways of giving relatively free rein to groups like Al-Qaeda and now Islamic State to be active in Afghanistan. So there's an incentive for the Taliban not to do that. Whether they can be trusted to rein them in is another question. But again, if they're not recognised as the sovereign government of Afghanistan, that also gives flexibility for external actors to undertake military operations against those terrorist groups when they see fit.
Oh, okay, that's an interesting point, because Boris Johnson had said this morning that no one should bilaterally recognise the Taliban. So is that a mistake to do that?
Well, I mean, this is going to be this is probably the most pressing foreign policy question for the immediate future. Do you recognise the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan? I don't think we're probably going to see any movement on that in the short term, because government's going to want to see what Taliban's true colours actually are. And their domestic political audiences aren't going to want countries to recognise the Taliban if they crack down on the social order, if they deny women their legitimate rights. These are the kind of things that Taliban are going to have to grapple with, because the one thing that you can deny them at the moment is sovereignty.
Yeah.
And so that's the one bargaining chip that the West still has, and it's a not insignificant bargaining chip.
Yeah, well, I put that question to the Prime Minister a short time ago, and he actually disagreed with Boris Johnson on that front. And perhaps the reasoning is, like you laid out there, it can create bigger problems if they don't recognise the Taliban later on down the track. It's an interesting point. Meanwhile, Rodger, I mean, the future is probably not going to be very clear or even very good for women and girls in Afghanistan. One of the problems it may also create too is a potential refugee crisis. Does Australia have to come in here and help out?
Well, it depends what you mean by help out. Obviously, there's going to be a humanitarian crisis. People want to get out, but traditionally, the vast majority of Afghan refugees from previous Taliban rule ended up in the regional countries, so in Pakistan and in Iran. So those regional countries tend to take the bulk of Afghan refugees, which I don't think people in the West quite understand. It's quite difficult to get out of Afghanistan at the moment to the West. Certainly there'll be smuggling routes set up, and some of which are already in play. There will be a humanitarian issue where Afghan refugees will need to be addressed, but I think the large part of that is going to be felt in the regional countries and not so much in the West, at least in the short term.
Okay, Rodger Shanahan, really interesting chat. Good to get your thoughts this morning. Thanks for joining us. Talk to you soon.
My pleasure.